Hey guys, it is finally that time of the season to do our jury scenarios video for Survivor 48, where in this video we'll be talking about each of the possible final 3 scenarios that could happen on this season, and then forecasting what I think would happen in a jury vote if those scenarios were to happen. And I think this is definitely an interesting final 5 to break down here, where while I am very confident in who the winner is going to be, I do think the path forward is definitely up in the air, and I do think there could be a number of different paths for how we get to this eventual final 3, even though I'm going to do my best to break down what I think will happen by the end of it. Now at the time of recording, there are 5 people still in the game, those being Eva, Joe, Camila, Kyle, and Mitch. And first up, we need to talk about Joe, who has been my frontrunner for pretty much the entire season, outside of a couple episodes where he was number 2, and I do think Joe is going to win. I do think that the season has been strongly leaning towards a Joe win based off the edit, even though from a pure game standpoint, I think there's definitely some issues to be had here, where I know a lot of people online have been talking about how it seems like Joe's being set up to lose to a bitter jury at the end, how he hasn't been treating the jury well, how he's been preaching on honor and integrity, and that's going to lead to the jury voting against him. And I would agree that this jury is not really in love with Joe, considering he has been preaching on honor and integrity. You have people like Chrissy talking about how he's treating it like the Olympics and how everyone needs to turn on him and is annoyed at everyone for not doing so. You have David feeling betrayed by Joe. You have the likes of Mary calling him out on the show for his blatant jury management when he was making it seem like he was like trying to make things up to her. And I think Joe's very much playing with fire when it comes to trying to play the honor and integrity card, especially when we're looking at other players from Survivor history who tried to do the same thing. People like Mike Turner from 42, Coach from South Pacific, even going back to Colby from Australian Outback. And while I think the honor and integrity aspect is something that Joe is utilizing well to keep his alliance together and to ensure that he's not the biggest threat around, it's also a strategy that has historically led to bad jury management, as it makes you come off as hypocritical when you do backstab people, and it also makes you not really own up your game a lot of times. So I do think those are some pretty big setbacks going for Joe in how he's approaching the game. But at the end of the day, I still think he is going to win a jury vote at the end, where even though a lot of the jury is not very happy with Joe, I think they're also not very happy at the people that have enabled Joe to remain in power, where I think they recognize that Joe's the biggest threat. We've had people talking within the game about how Joe's the biggest threat and how they need to get him out. And I think the fact that they aren't taking Joe out is probably giving Joe more credibility, where yes, they are probably annoyed at Joe and how he's acting around camp, but I think they're also just as annoyed at the other people in the game, people like Mitch, people like Shaheen, even people like Kyle and Camila, who are not taking the shot when they know that Joe's the biggest threat and that they should get him out. So I do think to that end, I don't think they're going to be bitter enough to vote against Joe here when it's pretty clear that he is the biggest threat in the game, and people seem to know that, and yet they aren't taking the shot here. But then that brings us to Eva, who has a similar issue to Joe in the sense that she is also trying to claim that she is like playing with honor and integrity. She claims to be honest and never lies, even talks about how she's bad at lying. And I do think she has a lot of the downsides to Joe, but not really any of the upsides, where I think something to point out with Eva is that Eva's not really being talked about as the biggest threat. And I think Eva herself has been really underselling herself to other players in the game, where she has talked so openly about how she's a team player and the fact that she talks about how she's doing moves that benefits the team and wants to propel their alliance forward more so than her own individual game. And I feel like that's a way of talking that is not going to garner her any respect, where I feel like this jury is not going to respect someone who is so openly talking about how they're not playing for themselves, how they're more so playing for other players, especially when one of those players is sitting right next to her. I just find it very hard to see how Eva pivots at the end to try to campaign against Joe, especially when she is so willing to go to the end against Joe as well. So I think Eva's going to have a lot of the same downsides as Joe, but not nearly as many upsides, where I feel like Eva's not being talked about as a threat. I feel like Eva doesn't really have the image of this family man and someone who is like this big threat that would cause the likes of Joe to be war at the end. I feel like Eva is someone who's going to be seen as someone who enabled the likes of a Joe to get to the end and not really playing for herself there. So I do feel like Eva's someone who will probably struggle in a lot of scenarios, where I feel like if she's against Joe, the jury will be more so willing to vote for Joe over her. And even if she's not against Joe, I feel like she'll be against the likes of Kyle or Camila, these people who are going to try to talk up a big strategic game and try to make it seem like they play more for themselves compared to Eva, and I think the jury will probably believe them. So I do feel like either way, Eva's not really in a good spot to win the game. And that brings us to Kyle and Camila, and I actually kind of struggle with where I stand with them individually, where I feel like collectively they're probably around the same level, where I feel like both of them like kind of fit a similar mold, and I feel like both of them will try to fit like a similar contrast if they're up against Joe and Eva. Though I do struggle a lot in the scenarios where they're at the end together, or even though they do talk on the show about how they want to get to the end together, I actually don't think they're going to get to the end. I think one of them for sure is going to get cut, if not both of them even. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see scenarios where they're both there at the end. Though if I had to guess, I think Kyle's probably the bigger jury threat between the two of them, considering that Kyle is like someone who was part of the majority alliance for more of the game, whereas Camilla was more so behind the scenes. So I think through that, people naturally see Kyle's game a bit more, and they'll see Kyle's the bigger player between the two. And then if they're not at the end together, I do think it will depend on whether Joe's there or not, where I do think Kyle and Camilla will lose to Joe, largely due to the perception that they enabled Joe to get to the end, where yes, we did see in the latest episode that their whole strategy is to try to undercut Joe by getting him to target Shaheen so that they'll be able to later claim at Final Tribal that they were the real masterminds and how they manipulated Joe. But at the same time, I don't think that is going to work well with the jury, where I feel like they're more likely to look at Kyle and Camilla as these people that didn't take the shot, how they wanted to take this more half measure and try to like claim credit for a move after the fact. I feel like they didn't really sell the Shaheen move very well. I think it's going to be a lot harder to sell the fact that them targeting Shaheen is a sign of them dominating the game, where they could have easily just actually taken the shot at Joe and Eva. So I don't think their scheme is going to work out the way that they think it will, at least in the jury's eyes. And then I do think if they are able to get to the end with Eva and Mitch, I do think the person that is there is probably going to win. But I do think Joe getting to the end is probably going to be a bigger detriment to their game than what they're anticipating. And then finally, we do have Mitch, who I do think is the GOAT of the season. I feel like he's probably the person that is the least likely to win, which is funny, as I did say in the preseason that Mitch is someone who would inherently be like this big jury threat, with him having like this very sympathetic backstory and with him seeming to be this very likable person that it seems like he is someone that would win a jury vote more often than not. But I think a major problem for Mitch is he just hasn't really played the game. He's been on the bottom for very much the entire time. It has repeatedly turned down opportunities to make a bigger move in the game, where he's just enabled the core four to get to 6 in a spot where he's at the bottom. And even when it's down to the final 6, he thinks Shaheen is somehow a big move when he could have easily taken a bigger shot there. So I do think Mitch is someone who is definitely well liked by a lot of people. I don't think anyone really dislikes Mitch outside of possibly Star. However, I think he's also someone who is just going to have no respect at the end. Someone who was at the bottom, someone that just allowed this power structure to get towards the end, which I don't think is going to play well with the likes of Star or Mary. And in general, I'm not really expecting Mitch to be that big of a threat in really any scenario, but that's just where things stand. And then moving over to the jury, we currently have 6 people in the jury, those being Cedric, Chrissy, David, Star, Mary, and Shaheen. And as I said earlier, I feel like this jury is largely annoyed at the likes of Joe and Eva, how they have been preaching on honor and integrity, where we obviously had Chrissy being very outspoken in her final tribal, talking about how she was annoyed that everyone was allowing the big threats to get deeper into the game, and she gets taken out in that spot. And then you have the likes of David and Mary, who felt betrayed by Joe and Eva, where they worked with Eva for a lot of the early game until Eva turned on them, and then they look at Joe as someone who betrayed them as well. So I feel like there's definitely some animosity when it comes to Joe and Eva. However, as I said in the previous section, I don't think they're going to be bitter enough to vote against Joe if he were to get to the end, where I feel like outside of David and Mary, I think the rest of these people are going to see Joe as this big threat that was able to get to the end of the game despite everyone knowing that he was the big threat. And him having like a good enough like backstory with him like being a family man and someone who won a lot of challenges, and someone who was just able to keep people from flipping against him, the likes of Kyle, for instance, to where I think they are going to vote based off that. And I still think there are people who do genuinely like Joe as well, where Shaheen talked in his exit review about how he was super close to Joe. Even Star, someone who called Joe the Godfather. I do think there's still some good spirits out there for Joe that is going to help him there as well. And then I think outside Joe and Eva, I do think Kyle's someone who definitely could garner some respect as well, where I know Shaheen was also pretty high on Kyle, credits Kyle for flipping against them. David is also someone who really gave Kyle a lot of credit for manipulating Joe and Eva into flipping the game against him at the final 9. So while I think a lot of these scenarios are going to be mostly straightforward, I still think there are some interesting aspects that could ultimately influence whatever final scenario we do end up getting here. So with all that context out of the way, we have 10 final 3 scenarios to be talking about, and I'm going to be ranking them based on how likely I think they're to happen. But let's not waste any more time, let's go right into the video. So starting off at number 10, the final 3 scenario that I believe is the least likely to happen at this point is Eva versus Camila versus Mitch. And admittedly, I think the reason that this one is so low is mainly due to edit reasons, where these are essentially the bottom 3 people on my power ranking from this latest episode. And I do find it very strange to see how this final 3 ends up coming together here. Now, realistically, I think there is a game path for this to happen where, let's say that like Joe targets Camila and Kyle at the final 5, gets out Kyle, maybe due to Camila winning immunity. In that final 4, maybe Camila wins the final immunity there and puts Joe and Eva into fire. Eva wins, Joe lays down his game, and then we get to this final 3. I do think there is technically a game path for this to happen, but I think considering that Joe and Kyle have been set up more to win from an edit standpoint, I would just find it very confusing to see this being the true ending to the season, and would find it a little underwhelming if I'm being honest. Though I do think if this scenario were to happen, I would expect it to be a Camila win. Now, I do think Eva would still get some votes. I think Joe would obviously vote for her in this scenario. And then I do think Star is someone who probably leans Eva as well, as Star did seem to have a good enough relationship with Eva, but I do think the rest of the votes would probably go towards Camila here. Now, you could argue the likes of David and Mary could possibly lean towards Eva, but even then, Eva betrayed them, and I don't think they're necessarily high enough on Eva to vote for her over Camila. So I do think this would be a pretty decisive Camila win, but at the same time, I just don't think this scenario is happening, simply because I don't think any of these people have had great edits to warrant such a win. So I do think this scenario is pretty unlikely, so because of that, it is here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and I do think these next few scenarios are also pretty unlikely due to one common factor. But number 9, we do have Joe versus Camila versus Kyle, and the reason this one is so low is because it has both Camila and Kyle in it. Where, yes, you could argue that Kyle and Camila have been these big characters on the season, but considering that I am probably higher on Joe to actually win the season, I would find it very unlikely for both Kyle and Camila to get to the end together. And I would expect, especially with how the game's been laid out as well, for them to probably be split up along the way, either due to Joe winning immunity and throwing them into fire, or maybe like they get broken out the final 5. I find it very unlikely to see how they get to the end together, and especially with Joe there over Eva, where in this spot, it would be where Eva's being taken out, when I find it very unlikely to see how Eva gets taken out here when Joe's there, where you have like Eva having an idol to use a final 5 and even a final 4. I feel like unless Joe wins immunity, then they would just want to take the shot at Joe over Eva. And then even if Joe wins immunity, he'll just take Eva to the end. So I do find it very unlikely to see how this scenario happens. Though if it were to happen, I do think Joe would win pretty decisively here, where I think the only votes to not go to Joe would be David and Mary, which, as a spoiler for some of the other scenarios to come, I would expect David and Mary to be the main holdouts in a lot of scenarios involving Joe, as they do seem to be the most likely to be bitter against Joe, even though you have other people who were annoyed. But I do think David and Mary would probably actually be bitter in this scenario. And while I think it's up in the air over who they vote for between Kyle and Camila in this scenario, I don't think it'll really matter, as Joe would easily get the rest of the votes here. So at the end of the day, not too surprising, but I do think considering the factors that would need to happen for this scenario to take place or be pretty unlikely, which is why it's here number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have a very similar scenario, just swapping out one person, and here I have Eva versus Camila versus Kyle. And I do feel like this one is unlucky for a very similar reason, in the sense that I don't think Kyle and Camila are getting to the end together. I think it's very likely that they'll be broken up along the way. Though the reason this one is above the one with Joe in it is that I do think they're more likely to take Eva to the end. I think they're more likely to try to take the shot against Joe if they have the opportunity. And I do think Eva has a smoother ride to the end in general due to the fact that she has an idol to use for Final 5. And it doesn't seem like she's going to be a main priority to be targeted Final 4 unless Joe gets taken out 5. So I do feel like Eva should be pretty good to get here. Though I think the fact that Kyle and Camilla make this one less likely. And I do think if this scenario were to happen, I would expect Kyle to be the favorite here, where I think he would get most of the votes. Now, I do think Eva gets Star and Joe, and I do think Mary could maybe be up for debate along with David. I'm not entirely sure which one they go for between Kyle and Camilla, but again, I am operating under the assumption that Kyle is the favorite over Camilla, considering his position within the game. So I do think this could lead to a Kyle win. Though to be fair, it wouldn't shock me if we learn more information that suggests that maybe Camilla is more of a threat here and that maybe some of these people would vote for Camilla over Kyle. But either way, I don't think Kyle and Camilla are getting to the end anyway. So really a lot of this doesn't matter. So because of that, I do have it here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7. And this is another kind of strange scenario, but one that could actually be a bit competitive. Definitely more so than people realize. But number 7, we do have Eva versus Kyle versus Mitch. And I'm not really sure what to make of this scenario, if I'm being honest, where you obviously would have to break up both of the duos to get to the end, where maybe like a shot could take down Kyle and Camilla at the final 5, but then maybe a final 4, Kyle wins final immunity, puts Joe and Eva into fire. I do think there's definitely a path for this to happen, though it would obviously need to be predicated on Joe somehow not winning the final 2 immunities, which I don't think is super likely. And obviously that makes this one a bit less likely to happen. Though I do think if this were to happen, I think it could actually be a bit competitive, where I think Eva could possibly get some votes here, where she would still get Joe and Star as she did in the other scenarios. But then I think she could possibly pick up David and Mary, to where at that point it would possibly be a tied vote, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. Now, I do think Kyle would get the other votes pretty handily. I think he would get Chrissy, he gets Cedric, probably gets Shaheen in this scenario, and obviously he gets Camilla as well. I do think Kyle probably has more locked votes in this scenario compared to Eva, and I would say that he would inherently have the advantage. Though I do think David and Mary had the potential to shake things up, which would then cause a tie that Mitch would have to break. And I'm not sure who Mitch goes for. I would assume maybe he votes for Eva, simply due to the fact that they're both like of a similar background. But really, it's hard to really forecast for sure. But either way, I'm not expecting this scenario to be super likely either, which is why it's here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6. And I believe this is the final scenario that has both Camilla and Kyle in it. But at number 6, we do have Camilla versus Kyle versus Mitch. And I think this one is essentially just Kyle and Camilla running the rest of the game, where they are able to take the shot against Joe at final 5 and then final 4. Maybe like Kyle throws himself into fire against Eva and beats her there, though. Again, I think it's still kind of far-fetched in the sense that I would expect Eva to do well in the fire making challenge anyway. And I just find it hard to see how Kyle and Camilla just run the rest of the game, considering how they've been edited and considering just how confident I am in Joe, to where it would be strange for Joe to be cut right before the end alongside Eva as well, where I think both of them have been set up to at least get to the end. So I do find this one a bit far-fetched, even though there's technically a path for it to happen. Now, as I said, if this were to happen, I don't know how it would truly go, if I'm being honest, as it would essentially be a final 2 between Camilla and Kyle, as I don't think Mitch gets any votes. And I think this largely comes down to who the jury respects more. And I do think they lean towards Kyle in a lot of situations, where I do feel like if you read people's exit interviews, I think they talk more about Kyle than they do about Camilla. I think the fact that Kyle is more integrated within the majority alliance for more of the game would make people think that Kyle is more of a power player compared to Camilla, where I feel like Camilla is someone who definitely is more behind the scenes. So I do think that definitely plays to Kyle's favor, and that does lead to Kyle winning here. Now, I do think there's definitely an argument for Camilla getting certain votes, particularly Mary, for instance. And you can maybe debate the likes of Eva, for instance, but really, I don't think it matters. I'm operating under the assumption that Kyle would have more of the respect, and through that, I would expect Kyle to win this scenario. But at the same time, I don't think Kyle and Camilla are getting to the end anyway, so unless we get some exit interview information that shows how they would truly do at the end together, I'm inclined to think that Kyle would beat Camilla at the end. So for that reason, I do think that this scenario would be not so likely to happen, but if it were, I think Kyle wins. But for now, I do have it here, number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and this is another pretty interesting scenario, not one that I think is super duper likely to happen, but one that would be interesting to discuss. And here we have Joe versus Kyle versus Mitch. And really, this comes down to Joe and Kyle being my top two in the power ranking, as I do think it would be an interesting matchup. Though at the same time, I doubt it's going to happen, as this obviously does not have Eva in it. So through that, it would involve like Eva being cut along the way. And while I think there's definitely a path in the sense that Joe and Eva could be thrown to fire at Final Four, and you can argue that Joe would inherently be better at fire compared to Eva, considering he's a fireman. But at the same time, like, is Joe really going to take out Eva in the spa when he sees her as like his daughter, for instance? So again, I do think there's definitely some question marks there. But I do think this would still be an interesting scenario. And I do think if it were to happen, I think Joe would win. However, Kyle definitely gets votes. I think for sure Kyle gets David and Mary, as I do think they do like Kyle enough to vote him over Joe. And I think Kyle obviously also gets Camilla. I think that's 3 votes there. It's a 5-3 vote. Though I do think Joe would probably get the other votes here, where, as I talked about earlier in the video, I don't think the jury is going to see Kyle as the mastermind the way that Kyle thinks he is, where I think the fact that Kyle is just keeping Joe in the game and is just going to use Joe to like be like his coach, for instance, is probably not going to work the way that Kyle thinks it is. I think Kyle is really overestimating how bitter this jury is going to be against Joe. And through that, I do think Joe would probably get the votes simply due to them seeing Kyle as this big enabler in the game. But at the same time, I do think the fact that Eva's not there makes it a bit less likely to happen. So because of that, I do have it here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have a similar scenario, just swapping out one person. And here we have Joe versus Camilla versus Mitch. And I do think this one's maybe a little more likely in the sense that it would involve cutting Kyle along the way, who I do think Joe would see as the bigger threat between Kyle and Camilla. Though at the same time, I think these scenarios are probably around a similar level of probability, largely due to the fact that it does involve Eva getting cut along the way, which I don't think is super likely. Though I do think this scenario were to happen, it's essentially the same one as the one we just talked about, where I do think that the votes that Kyle got in the other scenario would just go to Camilla, where Camilla would get those 3 votes from David, Mary, and Kyle. But I do think Joe would still get the other votes here. And I do think the argument that I said about working against Kyle would also work against Camilla, where they would see Camilla as someone who didn't take the shot when she needed to. And probably even more so for Camilla, considering Camilla wasn't even in the core power structure. And the fact that Camilla just doesn't even take the shot when she wasn't even in the core 4 would probably be a bigger knock against her jury chances. So I do think at the end of the day, I still think Camilla will probably lose in this scenario as well. But I also don't think this scenario is as likely to happen. So because of that, I do have it here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and this is probably another interesting scenario as well, even though I do question how likely it is to transpire. And at number 3, we do have Eva versus Joe versus Kyle. And this one is kind of interesting in the sense that it would involve Mitch being cut along the way, who, again, I don't think Eva and Joe are that loyal to Mitch and probably would cut him like if it really came down to it. But at the same time, I do think they would at least try to get to the end with Mitch over the likes of Camilla or Kyle here. And I think this scenario were to happen, I do think Joe would beat Kyle with the same votes here. Again, another 5-3 vote, with this time Eva being the kingmaker in case there's a tie somehow, which I wonder who she votes for. But again, I do think the scenario is probably a little less likely to happen than some of the other ones. The reason it is at least this high, though, is that I do think Joe and Kyle are being brought up as like these big players, and it would be at least an interesting showdown, but not the most likely scenario. So because of that, it is here number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and we have a similar scenario, just swapping out one person. And here we have Eva versus Joe versus Camilla. And I do think this scenario is also like kind of a bit far-fetched in the sense that it would involve Mitch being cut along the way. Though I do think something propping up the scenario a little bit is that I do think Joe is at least more likely to see Kyle as a threat compared to Camilla. And through that, I could definitely see Joe trying to cut Kyle. And then maybe like along the way, Camilla wins final immunity, maybe throws Joe and Mitch in the fire, I guess. And then through that, Joe wins, takes like Eva and Camilla to the end. And like I said, I do think Joe wins this scenario. Now, I do think an interesting quirk is that I could definitely see David and Mary being more open to voting for Eva in this scenario over Camilla. As again, I don't think we really hear much of them talking about Camilla in their exit interviews compared to Kyle. So maybe they vote for Eva in this scenario, but even then it doesn't really matter as Joe would have the other 5 votes locked up. So really, I don't think much changes here. But I do think there is a pretty clear number one scenario for me, which is why this one is left behind here at number two. And now at number one, the final three scenario that I believe is the most likely to happen on the season is Eva versus Joe versus Mitch. And I do think this scenario makes a lot of sense from an edit standpoint, in the sense that Joe is someone who I do think has a winner's edit. I think Eva is someone who has a runner's up edit where she had a pretty strong start but fell off later on. And I think Mitch is someone who definitely fits more of like the Jake Cocaine model or the Owen Knight model of him talking about his constant failures and eventually losing at the end. I do think the edit largely lines up with other edits we've seen in the new era in terms of Joe having a winner's edit, but then Eva and Mitch having edits that are similar to that of other runners up. So I do think this scenario would actually make a lot of sense here in terms of them being the final three and having the placements of Joe winning and even Mitch losing at the end, which leads me to what would happen here. And I do think Joe wins, obviously. I think Joe would have like at least 6 votes locked up. Now, I do think David and Mary, again, could vote for Eva, largely as a way of being bitter against Joe here, maybe as a protest vote. But I do think the other votes would be pretty locked in for Joe, as I don't think anyone really has like a strong alternative, where I think they're probably not voting for Mitch and they're probably not voting for Eva either. Where again, I think even David and Mary are not that happy with Eva. They're just voting for her like because they're more upset at Joe when they don't really have a strong alternative there. So I do think this would lead to a Joe win, which has lined up with what I expect to happen on the season. I think from a gameplay perspective, the scenario also makes sense considering it would involve like Joe and Eva like winning out, and in turn like pulling in Mitch to take out Kyle and Camila back to back. So I do think it makes a lot of sense from a gameplay standpoint. I think it makes sense from an edit standpoint. And that's why I think this scenario is most likely to happen. So because of that, it is here at number one. And there we go. That'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe to help out the channel. Now, on finale night, I will be live streaming as usual, so be on the lookout for that. And then obviously after the season, I'll be doing my postseason coverage, such as my player ranking and my reviews, so be on the lookout for that. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that is the video. See ya.